Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. So it's a little bit difficult for me because I'm not really Swiss. I'm from the Principality of Liechtenstein, a very small country, closer to Europe than Switzerland. So I grew up in this European culture in a way, but what you see here when I'm saying landscape as an attitude, I really mean it. We need an attitude to the landscape. And here, of course, it's, as you see, it's not the same time, here and here. But that's very important for me, so to explain that landscape architecture has to do with space and time. I was invited this year several times, and I'm constantly asked to explain how do you design this kind of atmospheric landscape you are doing? And that's very difficult. In Harvard in February, the summary was, Günther Vogt is now saying it's no longer about space and time. And Gernot Böhmis, a German philosopher, said, but you really didn't understand him. It's especially about space and time. And then just copy him. And that's not really a solution for me. But to explain what is behind landscape, and I think today it's really an actual discussion, and it's very easy for me, it's not art. And that's from Hamish Fulton, a piece of art, but he is explaining that land art, or what he is doing, is not land art, and for me land art is after 1973, it's over, after Robert Smithson died. And this was a specific period in the American art scene where landscape was a piece or was in the discussion of art. But today I think we shouldn't discuss it as an art discipline. And I'm teaching architectural students, landscape architecture. And that's for me very important. It's not in a landscape discipline or landscape institute. It's the biggest institute in Europe teaching landscape architecture. But our students are not urban planner or landscape architects in the end. They're all architects, just architects. And I'm often criticized in Switzerland because of that, but I think that it's really important to teach architectural students the language of landscape. And I hope that some of them became landscape architects in the end, of course. So I have always 3 or 4 of my students working in our office, mainly from the Netherlands. Very, very interesting. So coming from the Netherlands to Switzerland, and then after 4 or 5 years, they are always homesick to this super boring horizontal landscape, and they are super homesick. I don't know why, because in Switzerland you have so beautiful landscape, but they are always homesick to this super boring horizon. But nevertheless, I'm interested to teach our students the language, and therefore I would like to introduce you a little bit to the typology as we understand landscape. And it sounds a bit conservative, but the problem with architects I sometimes have is that we don't speak the same language. Let's say a landscape. This is a stadium in Munich with Herzog and de Meuron, and we designed it as a landscape and not as a park. Today, currently, we are transforming it into a park because the stadium is now used by tourists like a park, but 10 years ago we thought it should be a landscape for people living around, so crossing this green area to go further out. But today we transform it into a real park, and in the beginning for us it was a landscape. So that was this discussion with Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron in the beginning. that they would have to build car parking spaces, 12,000 car parking spaces, and it was foreseen in the program to have 4 buildings with 3,000 car parking spaces. And in the first meeting I proposed, but it should be part of the landscape. Why don't we use this topography of the motorway around, it's 7-meter high walls and so on, so we can cover it with a landscape. And that was in the competition, the beginning of our concept and what we built afterwards. So it's a huge car parking area, and it's an infrastructure landscape, let's say, and then on top you have this use for the fans and so on. And it looked for many years like a landscape, but now it's used from tourists coming not only for the matches, but for to see the stadium, to see the museum inside. Now it's transformed by people using it as a park. And of course I cannot explain all the projects, but with every typology I show a concept. That's vegetation outside the stadium. We used this special, so a different use from different living species than the sports fans, but it is in a way it's the same use. So they walk a lot on these meadows, and it's a similar use, and we used exactly the same plants. We even collected seeds from here and put it on top of this landscape in front of the stadium. Then the promenade. And for us it's really important, because I have so many people working in our offices coming from so different background. For instance, we do field trips in our office to see real landscape. And then last time we had an Australian guy and a Chinese girl. They both have never seen a mountain. They have never seen snow. How can you discuss about landscape in Europe when you don't have this language and people understanding what you are talking about? And this is in Bremen, the transformation of a former harbor into a park and a promenade. And of course, all magazines are constantly publishing this photo with more or less black concrete, because I'm socialized by Swiss architects, so concrete is very important. But for us, it's more important this, not the planned space, but the lived space. There is a difference, as Henri Lefebvre, the French philosopher, is saying, there is a difference between the planned and the lived space. And I think for us, it's very important to understand people using it, transforming it into a public space is more interesting than the aesthetic aspect. I would say ethic against aesthetic. We are more interested in ethic, but we are constantly perceived as being very aesthetic. But we are much more interested people living there, people using this public space, than in this simple aesthetic aspect. Then the park. Perhaps you think, why do I explain the expression park? But I have colleagues, landscape architects, asking me, for instance, in Zurich, I was criticizing some of the parks, saying, these are not parks, but plazas. And then, yeah, but what do you mean? Do you really want to have green areas, lawn, meadows, and so on? And then I tried to explain, we promised as a professional organization that we have parks there. And people, normal people using it, public spaces, they understand and they know what a park is. But you did a wonderful design, but finally it's not a park, it's a plaza. It's more mineral, and it's not about vegetation, landscape, nature, whatever you expect in a park. And people, normal people, really see this problem that we are more or less constantly designing plazas and not parks. And I think that's a problem all over Europe. Here, a park for Novartis in Basel, where we did, in relation to the River Rhine, so embankments, different terraces, but you cannot build it here in Belgium or anywhere in Europe. It's, as you see, it's very dangerous. So that means it's up to 3.5 meters. You can fall down without handrails, but Switzerland is a very difficult landscape. So people are used to it, and even the health and public health and safety person agreed. So people will understand that it's a real landscape and not related to the River Rhine. And people are saying they are walking down to the River Rhine, but as always in Switzerland, it's on top of a car park. It looks like nature, but it's not really nature. And so we built these terraces going up like that, and then people think going completely flat that it's going down, but it's a bit a trick from the English landscape garden. Then Courtyard, being very important for us. I have to say in Switzerland and Germany mainly you have this a bit conservative tendency to build this kind of Blockrand, where you have always these courtyards. And I tell you, I'm running out of ideas. I don't know what to do anymore. But so I show you some. This is for the FIFA, the World Football Association, very famous in the last 2 years. But nevertheless, we built. They asked us to design 5 different landscapes relating to the continents, and this is what I'm showing now is this courtyard, and it's referring to the North American rainforest. So that means mammoth trees and all these kind of big trees. So it's not so easy, and of course it's 5 levels of car parking underneath, again, as always in Switzerland. So if you ever come to Zurich, you see 40% what's above ground and 60% is underneath ground. So coming from the Cold War, and that's very specific in Switzerland. So we built this North American rainforest, but it's not so easy because you cannot, let's say you can buy, let's say here in Belgium, we sometimes buy big trees, then you buy time. But for a rainforest, you cannot buy time. You have to build it. So this is our mammoth trees. The biggest are 3 meters trunks out of concrete, 16 tons, and they look like mammoth trees. And meanwhile, they have moss on it, even birch trees are growing on it. And so how it looks like today, 10 years later, you see this is, where is it? This is fake, and this is real. It's the same tree. This is out of concrete, and this is a real mammoth tree. And believe me, people working inside, there are still some people, they believe that this is real nature. They are parking underneath, but they don't understand that it's not possible that such an old forest could have grown before, but they cannot touch it. So it's the closest space is about 3-4 meters, so they cannot touch it, and meanwhile mosses are growing. It looks like nature, and they believe that it is nature. They are disappearing now. There are 8 or 9 of these trunks, and it looks like a rainforest. But for us, it's not so interesting to deal with fake and what is real and what is natural. But this is a kind of, let's say, a diorama. This old tradition where you showed in in a controlled area, a landscape or a space, but it was, everybody saw it and it was clear it's explaining, it's a bit didactic, it's scientific on one hand, but it looks like nature, or at least it explains like nature. But perhaps we can discuss afterwards about whether it's okay to work like that or not. Then square, I just show, you know it, it's Tate in London. We did just opened the second phase, and it's a bit of a problem for me to show you project. So last week when I prepared this lecture, my assistant told me we are not allowed to show in public, like in such a situation, 80% of our projects we are not allowed to show it in the public. And for me, that's a real problem. So when we are talking about public spaces and public landscapes or transformation of landscape, it's part of a political public discussion, as we are very trained in Switzerland. And I cannot show many of the projects I'm really working every day now. I'm not allowed to show it, and I think that's a real problem. We are losing a bit this public discussion about our project, whether it's good or not, but let's say just to have a discussion about what we are doing. And I'm showing this because we will, I would say, within the next 5 years, I hope that Nick Sirota from Tate Modern, he, during the opening, he said to a journalist who asked him, was there something you really didn't like? And then he said, yeah, we liked the work of Günther Vogt really, but we didn't give him enough money. But that's England. That's why they are leaving Europe, but hopefully we can transform it, because these birch trees are in the special water coming from the Tate with salt, and 7 million people are standing on the roots, and so it's very difficult to keep it. And we hope that we can, and it's a dream of Nick Sirota and myself, that we can open it to the River Thames, so that we can build terraces. The first time in London where we would have this relationship to the River Thames. I think this was the first time that a public space in London opened to the River Thames, because before it was always a sewage system, it was poor, it was ugly, it was rubbish. And then since we built this, the perception of public space, especially the River Thames, changed completely in London. And that's what I really like. If you have this kind of project, you can change the perception of a city. And of course, I have to say, when I started this project, I was very young, and I started with trees in a grid, in a line, and so it took me 2 years to understand that the British, for them, it was a disaster. It was the Frenchies. The French, it's a French culture, it's rational, we don't like rational nature, it has to be nature. And this is really the translation of this English understanding, how a public plaza, finally they don't even have an expression for a plaza as we have it in Italy, a piazza, a platz in Germany, or a place in whatever, in different countries, especially in the Mediterranean countries. They don't have it in England. But you cannot criticize it. I think, especially coming from Switzerland, you have to accept it and to translate this cultural difference. They have a square, but a square means it is green and a plaza on the edge. And so this was a long discussion until we brought it through, and it was finally built. So, a garden, finally. When I started my career, I was not a landscape architect, I was a garden architect. but the expression in Europe was garden architect. We don't do private gardens in our office, but I will show you two. It's always related with artists, or in this case, it was a very special case, a very close friend of mine. She is extremely rich, and she has one of the best building plots in Zurich. And she asked me, can you not please design my garden? And then okay, but you know, I don't like this garden center kitsch, and you want to have flowers. And so, no, feel free, you can do what you want. And then I said, okay, I do it, but I don't design a garden. And then she looked at me, okay, but then, okay, you can do it. And the beginning was that she organized a competition among different architects, and finally David Chipperfield won this competition, and she asked me to be the advisor to all 4 architects in this competition. This is the existing villa. And then, and before I really started to design, I really told her, no garden. I'm not interested to build a garden. And then I found out it could be interesting to deal or to work with landscape from before the building. And then I explained it to all the architects in the competition as well, and I think David Chipperfield really took English again. So he proposed an ensemble of 1, 2, 3, 4 buildings. And we proposed to reconstruct somehow the landscape as it was before, and it was a glacial landscape very close to the city center of Zurich. The topography is very strong, and so we proposed we would like to deal with this glacial landscape. But how can you deal with it? And then I found these people looking underground, so that means with an echolot or a radar where you can see. And I promised my client there are boulders underneath, and we found boulders underneath here. And I proposed, let's deal with this landscape, this invisible landscape, and not, of course, not to build a garden, but to keep these boulders in the position where they are today and in the future as well. And to build around this huge boulder, I didn't see it, but I just saw it on the radar, or this soil radar. So we built a cave, a grotto, however you say, but let's say to build a space around this boulder, to keep it in a space and not to destroy it. And that's now, she accepted it. I'm very happy that she accepted it. And we will build now around this boulder, we will keep this boulder in the position and build a kind of space around it. And it's accessible from her house, and we reconstruct the topography as it was before the former building was built. So it looks like a glacial landscape with this boulder. And this boulder is a kind of monument, and it's a kind of memory of this landscape. But you see, I'm not interested in gardens, but if it's coming so close, I'm nevertheless very interested in. What's coming more is this interior landscape. I don't like all this, it's very fashion. Even the very good architects are now on these green walls. And everywhere it has to be a green facade. I don't understand it. We never do it, just to be clear. But what's more and more coming is this idea of interior landscape, and like Herzog and de Meuron did it for the Tate, that the public space is not only outside, it can be inside the building as well, and I think that's very interesting. Here it was for the zoo in Zurich, very specific project, but we have it in many office buildings now, that people are interested to have nature inside the building. And we are doing very specific projects for nature now with this knowledge we have about tropical plants, but it's very difficult because many architects don't understand that the climate for plants is completely different to the climate what we expect as a working space. It has to be a completely different climate, and so we now work a lot with this, again, with this diorama idea where we create a special climate inside the building for the plants. And this was for the zoo, the so-called Mazoala rainforest. It's a rainforest in Madagascar. What was for me interesting, it's very fast. This nature is very fast. These photos are about 3 months after the opening. So you can produce nature very fast. And I learned in the school that you cannot destroy rainforest because it's not possible that rainforest grows again. But here we just showed that it's possible. But how can you work with this kind of projects? What you see here is a medieval principle of a forest in Europe, a special type of forest, of a medieval forest. So people can, in Europe or in Zurich, can understand what they see somehow. They understand it's not really a rainforest as we built it, but it was a kind of transformation. And for me, the most important thing was this title, Mazoala, is a peninsula in Madagascar. This gives the horizon, so nobody really knows what is Mazoala, but Mazoala gives the whole landscape inside the horizon. So that's why we are very interested in this title. And again, I'm not an artist, but what I learned from the artist, this can be very important to translate a project or to bring a project to the people really understand what you mean. So, and now I hope the film doesn't work. So it doesn't work. So what I'm showing here, I wanted to show the larger landscape is for us as landscape architects very important. And sometimes I'm invited in this kind of symposiums with urban planners and architects, and you know it, they are all starting next 25 years, 50% of the world population lives in city and so on. And my question is, what happens with the rest? And then everybody's asking me, what do you mean? I mean with the other 50% of the people and the landscape. And that's really a problem that nobody in the discipline of landscape architecture is really interested in abandoned landscapes. Here it's just, you see it, 1990 and 2012, the growing of the urbanization. Again, the film doesn't work, but what you see here, a white drawing with some red dots, and you see the year here and here. These are all the protected areas in Europe. So 60 years ago you didn't see Europe, now you see Europe, and Germany is more or less a national park. Everything is protected. And I could show you, for instance, staying here in Brussels, we wanted to see or to show our students abandoned landscapes in Europe. It wasn't possible to find a European map for abandoned landscapes. Then we have a very good GIS system. So we asked 6 questions. So income of the population, how old are the people, and so on and so on. 6 questions, and then we had a map of Europe showing abandoned landscapes, and you can't believe it. how much and how strong this process of abandonment in Europe is. For instance, you can see the former German wall, and you can see in France, in all Mediterranean countries, mainly Italy, how much these landscapes are abandoned. And what happens with these abandoned landscapes, that's what we are really interested in. And that was together with ETH Studio Basel, mainly with Jacques Herzog and Pierre Demaron. We did this research, and there, with the students, not just to do an urban planning semester and so on, but students were not allowed to propose any building, to propose any urbanization, just to think about the landscape within the sprawl. Because the sprawl is not really the problem. Today, I think the landscape in between the urbanization is a real problem. So this kind of infrastructure landscape, however you call it. And that was then our thing. The film doesn't work, but then it was our idea. These are the Alps, with all the red areas being protected, and our proposal was, why can we not think without the urbanization? You see Milan, Turin, Lyon, Marseille, Ljubljana, Vienna, Munich, and so on. We didn't show here the urbanization between 2015 and 2100, but it would be one city all around this common ground. It's not a park. It's not a central park. It's not a. It's a kind of landscape. But let's think it in a different way. Not this protection. Why should it be all red in the end and everything is protected? And just 2 weeks ago, the citizens in Graubünden and Ticino voted against a new national park in Switzerland. And I have to say, I can understand it. These people are using the landscape as hunters, as farmers, and they are allowed, they can go anywhere. If they don't have to use a footpath or so. As hunters, they go wherever they are interested, and as farmers as well. And they were against a new national park. And I think this idea of protection is a very urban idea, that we think we should protect the landscape outside our cities. But I think this is not the future, and this is not only a Swiss problem, I think this is a European question. Why should we constantly protect landscapes and to have special rules, how we can use it? And it's difficult to explain, I think, and I'm open for a discussion. So, for instance, in Basel, there is a very strict protection of trees. You cannot cut a tree thicker than 20 centimeters, and they do it with airplanes, and if you cut the trees, 2 years later they come, you have to pay, and so on. And I was completely against this law in Zurich, because I think a society who has to regulate the trees in a city, that's completely wrong. People have to fight for the trees. They have to know, we would like to keep this tree. It shouldn't be part of the legal world. We should protect the trees by an organization, a citizen organization. These are beautiful trees. We don't like to cut them, and so on and so on. And I think it should be part of the society, not of the legal world, and then we can sleep and say, okay, everything is regulated and it's okay. And I think that's a bit behind this idea to understand, but then this is a real problem. As you have it in Europe everywhere, here as well. This political administrative situation with 7 or 8 different countries, they have a common culture. I have a a seminar every year about urban food, how to feed a city and what has it to do with architecture and urban planning, and especially about the Alps. And then you see, especially the food is so similar from Slovenia to France. It's with all this dried meat, with the cheese and olive oil and butter. It's more or less the same culture in terms of food. But why are we not able to come together? But this is in Brussels big questions. But that's what would be my dream, to perhaps to bring it to the landscape, and not only a political question, but perhaps it's a cultural or landscape question, to bring these people together and to understand a space or a landscape as a common space. So now coming to how we work and how we design. And I have this theory that we have 3 types of designer in our office. One are the engineers, one are the, in French you would say bricolage, and the third one is like me, and there are 2 now in the office. They decide, for this project I work like an engineer, and for this project I work more like a bricoleur. So, and this is the beginning. Claude Lévi-Strauss described it in the wild, in the Pensée sauvage, that Indians in South America collected fruit, and they choose yellow fruits. For us, for you and for me, this is quite, it's just a color saying nothing. But it's the beginning of scientific thinking. And I think this idea of bricolage, bringing things together, you think it could work. And sometimes we do it in our office, that we start with a very simple discussion. And that's when I would ask in my office the engineer and the bricolage what's the outcome if they should have to propose a ship. That's completely different difference of thinking. And I just show some photos from Gaudi, who is in between this bricolage and engineering, because everything hanging can stand. So a very simple idea, but it's somehow already engineering. And he's really in between these 2 worlds. That's why I'm really fascinated of his work. And you have it a lot in the landscape discipline. Ferdinand Cheval in France, for instance, Palais Ideal, and he built it on weekends, on the free time, and then it looks like that. And this is definitely a bricolage. And so that means whatever you have on your table, you take it and you deal with what you have on your table. And the engineer can be top down, and the bricoleur is from bottom up. And it's a completely different understanding how to design. And finally, he got even a post stamp. So when we are designing, or we start a design in the office, by the way, we always start with a model, with a physical model and large-scale models. And we call it process cartography with the students as well. And I saw many students in the audience. Believe me, you all started your education and you thought, yeah, design and it's creative, and so it's only 10% of your job. 90% is something else, development and analyze and research. But our analyze and research is very, very extensive, and I just show you some samples. So an exhibition, for us it's very important to show our work in the public. So Wunderlust and Wanderkammer, it's normally Wanderlust and Wunderkammer. It was the ETH asked me to show how we work in the gallery in New York. So we did 3 cupboards and showed our work. Nothing in here is from me, it's all from my colleagues in the office. And it was in a very tiny gallery in New York. It was really only for 2 or 3 people, where we showed our research like a Wunderkammer, and with a lot of research we did about soil, vegetation, and so on. So this Wunderkammer is very present in our office more and more. And there is our office. And I have a bit medieval lifestyle. I live just a building nearby. And this is a river coming. So Zurich has 2 rivers. This one is coming from the lake, and this one is coming from the landscape. And I think that's very important for us to be somehow present in an urban situation, but to understand the landscape outside. So why are the 2 colors or the 2 rivers so different? So, and to understand, again, if you have people with such a different background like China or Australia or so on, so we are able to discuss on eye level. We have to have this common understanding, what are we talking about? And then, of course, there are field trips, very important for us. So this, for instance, a test we did with a camera obscura here, sketching, but isolating yourself. This is very close. This are the 2 rivers. So sitting in here for 1 hour and you have a small hole where you see the landscape outside, the perception of landscape is very different. And so we do field trips here in Aran Island, where we were interested in, there are no trees and it looks like a suburban landscape with the walls, but the buildings are missing. So to understand, and we did really an interesting research with photos, sketches, and so on. And here that's more my personal interest about vegetation in the Himalayas. I'm redoing these expeditions of the plant hunters, where they explain what they found in China, India, and so on. And then they describe this landscape as very wild, and when I read the list of the plant names, it looks like suburbia, because these are all our garden plants. But for them, it was very wild and natural, and so. And this is my personal interest in field trips, but we do it with people being interested in the office quite more and more. And again, it's not art. And here, Robert Smithson, and what I learned from the artist, or still I'm learning from the artist and architects, that they think and work in a different way that we do in landscape architecture. And to understand, so I'm working with Dan Graham as well. I will show a small work we did together. And he explained me Robert Smithson's work, because Dan had a gallery and showed all these artists in the early 60s. So Dan and Robert Smithson as well went to the suburbia to study suburbia. And it's the monuments of suburbia. And that's not really nice in a traditional way, but I learned how they worked and how they understand or explained themselves the world. And I think I'm more interested in this working method than to do or to be an artist. I had half a year ago a young architect gave me his business card, and there was urban planning, architecture, landscape architecture, and art. And then I said, how many people are working in your office? And he said, 2. And then I said, who is doing the first tip? the other discipline, what do you mean? Because you have 3, but you have 4 disciplines. How is it possible to work in all disciplines? And I think it's just not possible to work. I think you can work in architecture and urban planning, that's possible. But a third discipline is very difficult because it's just not serious. And I have to say, I stay what I am. That's enough complicated, but you can decide yourself. So what we are doing in the beginning is always this research about here, it's about this park. I already showed you about Basel to understand the city of Basel. And I'm quite often, especially in Germany, asked how is it possible to work like that in terms of economics and so on. Then I could say we are very well respected in Switzerland as a discipline. That means that our fees are a bit higher than in the rest of Europe. That's one explanation. And the other one is we quite often work in Basel, so we can constantly use this research we did here or we just do now about Basel. We constantly use it or reuse it for other projects. And that's this common knowledge in the office is, for me, more and more important. How can you build your own archive of knowledge? And we did, really, I could show you for 3-4 hours now, this research we did there about vegetation, geography, geology, field trips. And then we even built models of this existing nature, just to understand our own models. And when we design, how does it relate to real nature in terms of photos, or when we compare it with models, density, and so on. This was one of these models for the park in Basel. And we really, from the beginning, we start with models. And that's not very common with landscape architecture. But we trained ourselves and we are constantly exploring new ways of model making. And I think that's really important, especially if you have this tradition like here in Switzerland, where if you win a competition in Switzerland, it's not clear that you will build it. You have to go in a public discussion, and then you have this public votes, and if, like in such a auditorium, you have to present whatever it is, a plaza, a symmetry, whatever, and in the end, after 1 hour or 2 hours, if people are saying no, it's dead. It's definitely dead. So you have to be well prepared. The government really has to deal with the citizens. What do they expect in the public space? And so for us, we found out that the model is really an invitation for normal people, craftsmen, teacher, whatever, that they really can discuss on eye level with us, because they don't really understand drawings. And it's really an invitation for people, for normal people, not really used to read drawings. If we show a model, they can really discuss. They are on our level to discuss, and that's much easier to discuss ideas. Very short, because this would take hours, program and Gestalt. Just one example, it's a public space where quite often you read today public space, but what is for you a public space? I would really like to know it, because you can ask me, I have a definition. Here in Rome, it was quite obvious from the Nolli plans that the churches were public spaces. That means at night times they were open for poor people to sleep there, to use it as a space, as a protected space. Today, of course, it's closed. But in those days, it was really a public space. And for me, a public space today is very easy. And believe me, I would change the world if it would be all over the world. no CCTV cameras, 24 hours accessible for free, and drinking water for free. And if we would have these three conditions, we would change the world. Very easy, but it's not so easy on all parts of this world. And again, the program, I cannot say more, especially the architects among you, but the landscape architects as well. We constantly get this kind for competitions, a kind of so-called program, and then when you have to build such a building, then you are asked to build an auditorium for 200 people, so many toilets and a foyer and so on. This is not a program. This is really the demand of space. But I'm interested in a program means, and I would like for a competition, for instance, to have a text where these people, let's say a city or the jury, is describing a little bit the atmosphere. What would you expect to come here, to see other people, to listen to a lecture, to have a coffee, whatever? It's always only related to square meters. And then it's a foyer, it's a cafe, and so on. This is not a program for me. And that's really missing for me in architecture and landscape architecture, that we never get a program. For instance, as landscape architecture, we get a so-called program, and then there is a so-called children playground. And then I ask, what age? What do you mean? Yeah, 4, 5 years, 7, 8, 10 years? This is completely different. What is the program? And this is just a description, a general description, but not really program. So the coexistence of children playground with normal park visitors and so on, I would like to read this when I read a program, but it was B2. So, now the atmosphere. Coming from Switzerland, it's very easy to have wonderful atmospheres in landscape, and but I have to tell you, the English, the Swiss Alps are an English idea, because the Swiss didn't go up, it was too dangerous. Finally, it's an English idea. And I found the same situation 2 years ago. There was a heavy storm in New York, and I felt like in the Swiss Alps. It was very similar because of the scale and the weather. Very similar to what I experienced in the real nature, in the real landscape, like in the Swiss Alps. And so I think that's very important. We can leave our landscape, our country, but we always take ourselves with us. And then we have this special experience, we have this memory of special landscape. Or when I'm saying the English really found it in a way, the Swiss Alps. This is Turner, and I read his text where he was describing Switzerland is very beautiful and so on and so on. But they don't have this English twin light. So he painted the English weather atmosphere on top of the Swiss Alps. And you can have it in rose and in pink and in blue. So the English understanding or atmosphere or weather conditions on a landscape. And I think we did a project just in front of here together with Peter Zumthor. And it was for us very inspiring, so that you can have a landscape and you add your idea or your inspiration coming from somewhere and not relating. So we are not always related to the site. So sometimes it can come from far away, like here from England. And it was for us a real help to work in such a landscape together with Zumthor on architecture and landscape architecture. And sometimes we shouldn't forget that when we are talking about atmosphere, it's really coming, this expression. And so we are not alone on this world. So this is a Japanese sign or for Ma. Ma means It's very difficult to explain. Hopefully there is no Japanese in the audience, but I try to explain very simple. It's a space in between spaces. It's not a threshold. And if you ask a Japanese, they all know it. And then if you ask, can you please explain me? They cannot really explain it. I tried, very simple way. So our understanding of this space is there is the ceiling, the walls, and the floor. But this means a space we are creating now. I'm talking to you, you're listening to me. This is a space. This changes the world completely. If you have this completely different understanding of space, and I know it's very difficult to explain it, but meanwhile, at least I understand what the meaning is, but not completely, but I somehow understand the meaning. And we shouldn't forget that our view on the world is very Eurocentric. And it's like the Swiss believing that they are in the middle of Europe. They are in the middle of Western Europe. No, this is... since the Second World War, the world changed, and this is a kind of ongoing misunderstanding that we think our perception of the world is the perception of the world, but that's not the only truth. Oh, that's a shame that I cannot show this film. I'm working with a young Swiss artist, Julien Charrière, and there was a film, and you would have believed it's the Swiss Alps, but finally it's in Berlin, where his studio is, and the film was about this part, and it looked like the Alps in the Valais, where he's coming from, but this is, you see, he produced it with floor and with fire extinguisher and so on. So I'm working with him, and he's really interested to work with landscape and in a very artistic way. And I think that's, for me and for our office, an inspiration to see a different way how to look on landscape. And the last, of course, there's always an example from the office about atmosphere. This is a very small courtyard with just this birch forest, and we got a prize from the Natural Conservation. They didn't see this. Again, it's a car parking underneath, but people looking at it thought this is beautiful nature, but it's not really. It's 80 centimeters of soil. But what is for me interesting again, when I was asked in Harvard to talk about atmosphere, I collected around 28 or so from a Sunday newspaper, famous or half-famous people were always photographed in this birch forest. And then it was too cold, and then in December they copied it in the Congress Center in Zurich. But what's really interesting is that for me, so for instance in Switzerland we are having this, I call it Greece Roman freestyle auditorium in school areas where never a teacher is teaching kids, but they build a kind of audience like we have it here now. But in reality, you don't have to build this kind of auditoriums in Roman, Greek freestyle. Oh, such a shame that the film doesn't work. It's for me, it's people. You see it here. People understand an urban situation as a stage, and I think I know it's not so easy to explain it, but here it works. That people understand a city or a small site in a city as an urban stage, and then they transform it as a stage for themselves. You don't have to build the stage, people have to transform it into a stage, and I think that's for us very important. So sustainability is so and it's the main thing for us. So besides all this typological question, I think we have like atmosphere, we have sustainability, we have other themes being part of our design. For me, it's important that sustainability is really important, coming from the German forest discussion 200 years ago. But it's invisible. If you see it, it's so didactic and it's not interesting. And to show it, this is the history of the potato coming from South America. And it's very easy to explain why are the potatoes here so successful? Because they are on 800 meters. You have all these terraces, and you have different species growing on all different terraces. If the weather is not good this year on this level and better on the higher level, you always have enough potatoes. But if you do it in Ireland, like here, one species, and it's all on the same level, more or less, and then a disease is coming and destroys the whole production of potatoes. And I think this is in a way very visible now for you, because I showed you these images. But in our concept, I think it's very important that you don't see it. Ecology and sustainability shouldn't be visible. Then it's too didactic for me. That's one example, the Laban Dance Center. And it looks like it looks because of a very strong regulation. So you don't see any trees. There is a very rare species, only for London, not for the rest of England. It's a black redstart living there. And this black redstart needs gravel area, loose gravel. They are on top of this roof. And no trees, because bigger birds like crows would attack this small bird. So we were not allowed to plant any trees, and the soil is so contaminated, so we were not allowed to move it from the construction site. We could move it on the site, but not move it away somewhere. So very strong restriction, and we accepted it. So just to design a landscape for with this specific restrictions. And it looks today very artificial, but finally it's one of our most ecological projects. But you don't see it if you don't know it. So finally, one project, Rectory Farm in London. Again, when in our office in London, when we start a project, even if it's only a courtyard, I always ask, where is it in London? It's always this relationship to a very small project to the bigger context of London. And here is London, a very specific city, as you know, and because it's the Brexit is London and not England, a real problem. So it's a project. It would be, or it's on hold because there are real problems with legal problems. This is a farm. This is Heathrow Airport, and we were asked to design this park. It would be the biggest park, the largest park in London in the next 25 years. So how it looks today, it's an abandoned farm with this kind of low-level urbanization around with simple houses. And then we did a lot of research. Again, I cannot show everything. How is it positioned in London to Greater London? And how does a traditional park like Hyde Park, Regent Park, Greenwich Park, how does it relate to this English understanding of a park, and how does it relate to the city, because it's really on the edge? And we did research about these historical parks, but in the same time, it's part of the green belt. So the green belts all around London. It's part of this green belt, and it's part of this traditional park leading to the center of London. And what's really interesting in London, and I really love the English understanding of landscape architecture, they still have a map of landscape types in London. If you drive through London, you just see buildings, but they still have a map showing the landscape types underneath. They love landscape. But it's difficult nowadays with this capitalism. And then we did an analysis of all these existing smaller parks, not only the touristic and famous parks. And of course, this is the reason why they will build a park here. This is the valley of the River Thames, and there is a lot of gravel underneath. That means 12, 15 meters layer of gravel where you can produce concrete or for production, construction. The problem here was in the beginning, you know, that in London you don't have, like here or in Switzerland or in Germany, where you have a strong government telling you in such a situation what is the demand of the people living around. And I mean, do they need a football playground, whatever? There was absolutely nothing. So we hired the young office colleagues. They did the interviews all around our site to find out what are people expecting if we build such a park. They even didn't know that there is a park planned. And that's really, especially in London, I think a problem since Margaret Thatcher, she believed that the liberal market will sort out all this problem with public spaces. That's not reality. And so we have to do it as planners, so to find out, and that's why the program is for us so important. What is really the program? If you don't have like here, where you have in every quarter in Brussels, I can imagine you have urban planners, architects, landscape architects from the government leading you, and they exactly know what people are asking for. Here you have to do it yourself, and that's really a responsibility what's not so easy to find out, and you have to be very careful. You don't get all this information. We did all ourselves. And then we did extensive field trips around the green belt, and I found all these extensive parks very interesting for our park, and not this more, as you know, Hyde Park, Green Park, and all this very famous touristic park. And then in the end, the concept was very simple. We need a huge park relating to the green belt, and we need a neighborhood park for the people living around. So that means a completely different program for the park here and the park here. In the end, it looks like one park, but the program is completely different. And just to show, then we started with model these two different park types. And you can imagine, as I'm not so French with rational alleys, but there is a reason why it looks like that, and that's the reason. That's, by the way, the reason why these people in London asked us, because they told me, you know, you are in Switzerland so trained to work on car parking spaces, to build parks above. They will take, and we are working with Arab engineers, they will take the soil away, drill holes into the soil, fill it with concrete, and then pour a concrete slab on top, and then the next 25 years under, they will take out the gravel for this concrete production. But in the second year, we can start to build the park. So it's not a an empty hall for the people living in the neighborhood for 25 years. They will not see anything, and it's really it's like a mining or an infrastructure project. So it looks like that. That's the reason why the trees are planted as they are planted. And just to give you a bit an idea of the scale, this is Amazon outside London, and it will be 10 times bigger. And this is the biggest storage space in London or in Europe, and it will be 10 times bigger. And you can imagine there is a question of the economic basis, a very important question. What is in so many spaces? What can you do close to Heathrow? And now it's more server farms and MI5, because you have a lot of military and police there, so it's very well protected. You can bring very secret things inside. But this is a real question, the economy on such a large infrastructure and park project. And so we, in the beginning, and I have to say it is a very good client, they accepted that we didn't design from the beginning. So we told them we have to organize processes. For instance, how can we bring so many trees there? It's much too expensive to buy in European nurseries. So we proposed to establish nurseries there to really produce the plants. And we, at ETH, for instance, my colleagues, the architects, they are always working with reference images. I really hate it. So if you have a reference, then please reference the site. So all these images you see just nearby are either from our office or from just the neighborhood, where you have in the green belt similar park situation or atmosphere. And then I think it's possible to use reference images that people we are talking with understand what we mean, what kind of park it is. And this is, of course, reflecting the chambers underneath these alleys. And of course, there are many problems with the water flow underneath. But finally, we are dealing processes, social, political processes, the soil. How can we deal with this huge amount of soil and the trees and so on? And there it's less design and more dealing with processes. And of course, in the end, we have to show something. That's always a bit the problem. So we have to do this kind of analysis or drawings, how it could look like. But believe me, this is not really a design. It's really a pre-stage. It's a kind of a program, but drawn, but it's more programmatic and not really a design. So here's this neighborhood park, and here where we still have production, agricultural, horticultural production, and it starts to become a park, but it's for a very long time. I think for 25, 30 years, you have to think in a very long time period, how can you develop such a site. And I think it's not possible just to, or at least for us, it's not possible just to design it. You really have the responsibility to deal with all these processes. So that's it, the last one, 3 images, again, a garden, together with Dan Graham. I'm a very close friend of him, and he was invited to do something on the Metropolitan Art Museum in New York on the roof. And then he told the art museum, yeah, he would like to do something, but only with me, because he would like to build a garden, and he is an artist, he cannot design a garden. So together we did this project, and because I know him very well, he grew up in New Jersey, that's behind this skyline. So we built this New Jersey garden with the most beautiful park in the world, for me at least, the Central Park and the skyline. And this type of garden is behind the skyline. And I think it was for us a very interesting discussion because he's a very conceptual artist. He didn't know that he shouldn't reflect the geometry should be different of the pavilion to the existing building, and he was very, very happy that we showed him how to position the pavilion. And again, I'm not an artist, I'm discussing with 10, 7, 8 hours when we start to talk about mainly architecture. We love to talk about architecture. But he and myself, we never designed a building, and we will never design a building. We are quite happy to be landscape architects or artists. But he knows so many things about gardens as well, the French Baroque and Manieristic gardens. Even for me, it's sometimes on the edge, my knowledge compared to his knowledge. And that's what I learned from these people, like artists. The knowledge behind their work is unbelievable. And especially to the students in the audience, knowledge is in the future very important. Thank you.